This is Muybridge's business card, which shows how many different things he did, except that he didn't actually do portraits at all. But I thought it would give you a sense of him, that he was a commercial photographer and that he was actually making, which meant that he was making a living at it. He was working with galleries in San Francisco and elsewhere. And and this is his patron or producer or what have you, Leland Stanford, who founded the university named after his dead son with his wife. Leland and Jane Stanford founded the university named after their son. And so one of the postulates of this book is that Muybridge in some sense founded the technology that would become Hollywood, which is one portion of California. But Leland Stanford, sponsoring Muybridge's scientific research, was on his way to founding the university that would give rise to Silicon Valley. So River of Shadows, my book about Eadweard Muybridge, is really kind of a prehistory of Hollywood and Silicon Valley. This question of why these two incredibly powerful institutions that have so shaped the modern world are both in California was one of the things that interested me, as is the question of why only some slides are showing. This is another picture of Eadweard Muybridge from his Philadelphia motion studies, showing that he's in very good shape and completely lacking in Victorian respectability. So this is one of my favorite pictures from his earlier work. He was a great landscape photographer, a great experimentalist. To get the sky exposed the way that it is, you either had to use his sky shade, because the sky was always overexposed in the photography of his time. So you either got a white sky or an underexposed landscape, unless you cheated. He may have added those clouds later, which he often did, or he may have covered half the camera lens as he was making it to achieve this wonderful Caspar David Friedrich-like picture of the lone figure in the landscape. I said Muybridge never did portraits. Although photography was from early on used for portraiture, Muybridge always had a greater distance from his subjects. There's a kind of alienation or loneliness throughout his work. And his figures are always representative of boxing or running or leaping. They're never personal in a sense. Here's another one of South Park, which was once called, what did we call it during the dot-com boom? It's where Wired magazine and a lot of the dot-coms were centered in San Francisco a century later, 130 years later. This is a commercial picture he took, which I love because it's full of clocks. And for me, his story is so much about the transformation of the experience of time between when he was born in 1830, when the first passenger railroad ran, and 1839, when 9 years later, when photography was invented, 1844, when the telegraph became one of the technologies wildly accelerating everyday life, to his own contribution with vastly speeding up photography so it could capture animals and people in motion and then reanimate them through that zoopraxiscope, which is a precursor of the movie theater. So this is but his work is often seen as these very separate bodies of work, and it's really very consistent. He's interested in series and sequences, in scientific studies, in things in motion, in a kind of experimental work, but also a kind of sequential narrative. This is a series of cloud studies he did early on with it. And why would you do cloud studies? It's not the kind of stereoscope cards which these were taken from that people were usually doing. And it's really because he's making photography for use by artists and scientists, because he's already in dialogue with how these things would be used in their time. So, and this is really where I wanted to start with the lecture, with his photographs of horses as commissioned by Leland Stanford. And it's worth noting that Stanford really always thought this project was about horses. But Muybridge always knew it was about photography and time, and that horses were just the beginning. And he would take it much further, and then Thomas Edison and Etienne Jules Marais, the Lumiere brothers, and others would take up what he had begun and finish it, at which point we would have cinema as we now know it. So this is a lecture in 3 parts, and I will give with a slide refresher courses, or shall we just, since they're now seen as such an archaic technology, I think we should just call them magic lantern slides and go all the way. And notice that nothing failed and you did not see the weird contents of my hard drive and, or any inappropriate things that might have been on my screen. I like old technologies. I like some new technologies too. In the spring of 1872, a man photographed a horse. The resulting photograph does not survive, but from this first encounter of a camera-bearing man with a fast-moving horse sprang a series of increasingly successful experiments that produced thousands of extant images. The photographs are well known, but their most significant is the bridge to a new art that would transform the world. By the end of the 1870s, these experiments had led to the photographer's invention of the essentials of motion picture technology. He had captured aspects of motion whose speed had made them as invisible as the moons of Jupiter before the telescope, and he'd found a way to set them back in motion. It was as though he had grasped time itself, made it stand still, and then made it run again, over and over. Time was at his command as it had never been at anyone's before. A new world had opened up for science, for art, for entertainment, for consciousness, and an old world had retreated further. The man was Eadweard James Muybridge of San Francisco, already renowned for his photographs of the West. In the 8 years of his motion study experiments in California, he also became a father, a murderer, and a widower, invented a clock, patented 2 photographic innovations, achieved international renown as an artist and a scientist, and completed 4 other major photographic projects. These other projects are also about time, about the seasonal and geological time of landscape, about the difference between the time that the camera sees and the eye sees, about a war between 2 societies with radically different beliefs about time and space, about the passage of a midsummer's day's sunlight across a city in turmoil. The experience of time was itself changing dramatically during Muybridge's 74 years, hardly ever more dramatically than in the 1870s. In that decade, the newly invented telephone and phonograph were added to photography, telegraphy, and the railroad as instruments for, and the resonance phrase used constantly in the 19th century, annihilating time and space. The big corporations were spreading their grasp across wider spaces and into more subtle interstices of everyday life. The Indian Wars were reaching their climax and their turning point. The modern world, the world we live in, began then, and Muybridge helped launch it. Muybridge produced more reliable high-speed photographs than anyone had before. His 1878 camera shutters were a triumph of electrical engineering that made reliable exposures of a fraction of a second for the first time, a speed at which extremely rapid motion could be captured in focus rather than recorded as blurs. The photographs were also a triumph of chemistry, which made the film fast enough to record so brief an instant. So both cameras and photochemicals were really slow before Muybridge. To take a picture, you often just took the lens cap off, whistled a little, admired the view, polished your nails, put the lens cap back on. It was normal to have an exposure from from several seconds to several minutes, often longer than several minutes. And photochemicals were also really slow, so it took those long exposures, which is why you needed to photograph the still world. Anything moving would turn into a blur. And you see these wonderful photograph slams of Victorian families where the adults are all very rigid, and the children, as they get younger and younger, get blurrier and blurrier, till the toddler is just a wriggly blur. And that doesn't happen with a 500th of a second exposure. You get the racehorse in mid-stride, the basketball player in midair. You see that on the sports page every day, those kinds of photographs. So they froze motion so that the legs of a trotting or galloping horse, then a leaping man, and eventually the movements of lions, doves, dancing women, water spilling, artists drawing, could be depicted as a sequence of still images. At the same time, Muybridge improved upon the zoetrope, a small device invented in 1834 that makes a series of spinning images seen through a slot appear to be a single image in motion. His zoopraxiscope, as he called it, projected versions of his motion studies on a screen, moving pictures of motion. It was the first time that photographs had dissected and reanimated actual motion. and was the foundation of cinema, which emerged tentatively in 1899, in full force in France and the United States by 1895. Motion pictures proper were invented by others, but no matter which way the medium's genealogy is traced, it comes straight back to Muybridge. And motion pictures changed the relationship to time further. They made it possible to step in the same river twice, to not see just images, but events that had happened in other times and other places, almost to stop living where you were and start living in other places and other times. Movies became a huge industry, became how people envisioned themselves in the world, defined what they desired and what was desirable. The Russian film director Andrei Tarkovsky thought that time itself, time lost or spent or not yet had, was what people desired and fed upon in the films that became a collective dream world inhabited by multitudes. It all began with photographs of a horse in California. In the spring of 1872, a man photographed a horse. The railroad baron Leland Stanford commissioned the photographs in the hope that they would solve a debate about whether a trotting horse ever has all 4 feet off the ground at a time. Muybridge's first photographs gave an affirmative answer to that minor question, but by later in the decade he realized that the project had broader possibilities and got Stanford to underwrite his development of them. He told an associate he was going to revolutionize photography with the technique he developed, and he did. The story of what Muybridge accomplished with Stanford's support is a peculiarly California story. Much has been written about the literary and artistic modernism that was born in Paris, but only high culture was born there, though that high culture was a response to the pervasive alienations and liberations brought by industrialization. Another part of the modern world came from California, and this part was and is an amalgamation of technology, entertainment, what gets called lifestyle that became a part of everyday life for more and more people around the world, and a form of industrialization itself. Perhaps because California has no past at least that it is willing to remember, has always been peculiarly adept at trailblazing the future. We live in the future launched there. If one wanted to find an absolute beginning point, a creation story for California's 2 great transformations of the world, these experiments with horse and camera would be it. Out of those first lost snapshots came a world-changing industry, and out of the many places where movies are made, one particular place, Hollywood. The man who owned the horse and sponsored the project believed in the union of science and business, and founded the university that much later generated another industry identified, like Hollywood, by its central place, Silicon Valley, which rose out of Stanford University. Hollywood and Silicon Valley became, long after these men died, the 2 industries California is most identified with, the 2 that changed the world. They changed it, are changing it, from a world of places and materials to a world of representations and information, a world of vastly greater reach and less solid grounding. So Muybridge himself was born in 1830 in Kingston upon Thames, a village near London on the river. His father and grandfather, grandmother and mother were in the barge business of transporting goods on barges, which was the most efficient transportation before the railroad. Goods moved on the barges along canals dug into the landscape, and the barges themselves were a slow-moving business. Muybridge's cousin Maybank Anderson recalled that when their grandfather Edward Smith drove in his gig to London to buy wheat or coal, he took under the seat of his gig a carrier pigeon and in his pocket a quill or 2, and when he bought a cargo, he wrote on a small piece of paper the number of barges he needed, put the paper in the quill, tied it under the wings of the pigeon, and set it free. Someone watching for the pigeon's arrival unfastened the quill, took the message to the barges, and they started. Pigeons were the fastest communications technology. Horses were the fastest transportation technology. They pulled the barges, which moved at the speed of the river, the pace of the horses that pulled them along the canals. Nature itself was a limit of speed. Humans could only harness water, wind, birds, beasts. Born into this almost medievally slow world, the impatient, ambitious, inventive Muybridge would leave it and link himself instead to the fastest and newest technologies of the day. But that world was already being transformed profoundly. On September 15, 1830, less than 6 months after Muybridge's birth, the first passenger railroad opened. The celebrated young actress Fanny Kemble had been given a preview of the Manchester and Liverpool Railroad that August. In a letter to a friend, she exclaimed, "The engine set off at its utmost speed, 35 miles an hour, swifter than a bird flies." For they tried the experiment with a snipe. You cannot conceive what that sensation of cutting the air was, the motion as smooth as possible too. I could have either read or written, and as it was, I stood up and my bonnet off, drank the air before me. When I closed my eyes, this sensation of flying was quite delightful and strange beyond description. 35 miles an hour was nearly as fast as the fastest racehorse, and unlike a gallop, it could be sustained almost indefinitely. It was a dizzying speed. Passengers found the landscape out the train window was blurred, impossible to contemplate, erased by speeds that would now seem a slow crawl to us. And if you ever tried looking out a car or train window, you'll realize that we actually look at a certain angle to see what's going on. If you look straight out at a 90-degree angle, it really does blur. And, we've learned to see at speed. It's not instinctual. It's not something that people in 1830 were equipped with. The world was going by in a blur for them when they got on those first railroads. Those who watched the trains approach sometimes thought they were physically getting larger because the perceptual change in a large object approaching at that speed was unprecedented. Ulysses S. Grant remembers riding on one of the early railroads in Pennsylvania in 1839 with the same amazement that most early travelers recorded. He said, "We traveled at least 18 miles an hour when at full speed and made the whole distance averaging as much as 12 miles an hour. This seemed like annihilating space. If distance was measured in time, then the world had suddenly begun to shrink. Places connected by railroads were, for all practical purposes, several times closer to each other than they ever had been." The New England philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson opined in 1844, "Not only is distance annihilated, but when, as now, the locomotive and the steamboat, like an enormous shuttle, shoot every day across the 1,000 various threads of national descent and employment, and bind them fast in one web, an hourly assimilation goes forward, and there's no danger that local peculiarities and hostilities shall be preserved." He saw the networks of railroads undoing the local character of every place, and approved of the erasure. People were being drawn out of their small, familiar worlds into one more free, less personal, less intimate, in which the associations that once attached each person, place, and object came undone. It was a leap forward of extraordinary liberation and equal alienation. Grant and Emerson were sounding variations on one of the stock phrases of the day, the annihilation of time and space, which was applied over and over to railroads and other new technologies. Annihilating time and space is what most new technologies aspire to do. Technologies regard the very term of our bodily existence as burdensome. Annihilating time and space most directly means accelerating communications and transportation. What distinguishes a technological world is that the terms of nature are obscured. One need not live quite in the present or the local. And Leland Stanford rose to power as one of the 4 builders of the Transcontinental Railroad, completed in May of 1869, which made it possible, which changed San Francisco and the West from a place that was many weeks by boat or stagecoach, many perilous weeks, usually a couple of months away from the East Coast, to a place where you could travel at ease in a week. It was now, suddenly it was a week between New York and San Francisco. A huge, almost insurmountable distance, a distance that had so separated the West from the rest of the country, suddenly became insignificant, and that was the last great piece of technology, along with the steamships and the railway across India, that made it possible to, in the title of that Jules Verne novel that came shortly afterwards, to go around the world in 80 days, which was breathtakingly fast then. The world had been almost infinite in scale, and it took long to travel. You might never return. It was arduous. It was an adventure. It was incredibly dangerous. You had to make your own way. And then suddenly you could just book passenger tickets on railways and steamships, and really almost as baggage, passively go around the world quickly. And we often think that the modern world began with our new communications, radio, televisions, and then computers and things in the 20th century. But the great leap that transformed everything, the great alienating step, was really in those decades in the 19th century. The first block when Muybridge was very young, the second block that he participated in the 1830s. At the far end of the railroad's arrival came another great transformer of time, photography. Photography did not impose itself on the world, but interpreted it, transporting appearances as the railroad transported matter. As a technology, it requires a very different argument about effects and merits than the heavy-duty icons of the Industrial Revolution. For if railroads and photography had one thing in common, it's that they brought the world closer for those who rode or looked. While the dull, repetitive toil of the factories seemed like slavery, these technologies often seem liberatory, unless you thought about the iron mines, the coal mines, the forges, the chemical factories. Photography did not appear all at once as we know it now. Photography was faster than painting, but it could only portray the slow world or the still world. People sat for their portraits with braces to hold their heads steady, and in those old portraits, fidgeting children are often a blur. Landscapes were photographed on windless days when the leaves wouldn't move and the water was smooth, often early morning or mid-morning, so you had enough light, morning because it's often stiller. The bustling 19th century had to come to a halt for the camera, until Muybridge and his motion studies. Even so, photography was a profound transformation of the world it entered. Before, every face, every place, every event had been unique, seen only once and then lost forever among the changes of age, light, time. The past existed only in memory and interpretation, and the world beyond one's experience was mostly just stories. The rich could commission paintings, the less rich buy prints, but a photograph really reproduced its subject with an immediacy and accuracy art made by hand lacked. And by the 1850s, it offered the possibility of mass reproductions, images for everyone. Every photograph was a moment snatched from the river of time. The youthful face of a beloved could be looked at decades after death or age or separation had removed that face, could be possessed like an object. It was only when the later photographic processes arrived on the scene that photography extended its grasp in space as it had in time. The images piled up and photography became an industry too. The world was growing larger and more complicated, and photography was both an agent of this enlargement and a device for trying to sort it all out and to own it, to make it more manageable. Photography had frozen the river of time, but a torrent of photographs began to pour forth from the photography studios into homes, pockets, albums. Photographs of pyramids, empresses, streets, poets, cathedrals, executions, trees, actors. 5 years after photography, one more technology, telegraphy, arrived to transform time. Telegraph messages arrived almost instantly as electrical impulses over the wires, a technology that telephones and the internet would only elaborate. "This is indeed the annihilation of space," the Philadelphia Ledger exclaimed over the first long-distance telegram in the United States. Many of the earliest telegraph lines followed the railroad tracks, and they replaced the railroad as the fastest communications technology. There's a story from that era about a thief who committed a crime in one city and leaped on a train, which once upon a time would have taken you away from everybody who knew what happened. You would have traveled faster than knowledge of your crime. They telegraphed to the next town and pulled him off the railroads. That information traveled faster than he did. Things were changing. News, words, data were dematerialized and almost instantaneous wherever the telegraph wires were strung. The distance between places that had once been measured at 10 miles an hour or less was wavering, drawing closer, almost dissolving. Telegraphs were much simpler than computers or cell phones, but information moved as rapidly along the wires as it does now. Before the new technologies and ideas, time was a river in which human beings were immersed, moving steadily on the current, never faster than the speeds of nature. Trains liberated them from the flow of the river or isolated them from it. Photography appears on the scene as though someone had found a way to freeze the water of time. Appearances that were once as fluid as water running through one's fingers became solid objects. Through the 19th century, as Darwin worked out his theories about literal evolution, it was as though consciousness evolved from something utterly immersed in this river to something that clambered onto land. There the atmosphere was thinner, the view was further, and no current forced these mutating Victorians to move at a set pace. But no water bore them up and carried them along either, and there was no going back. So a lot of people resisted this, unlike a lot of the technologies in our time. There was a lot of interesting criticism by writers about what these changes were bringing us, whether they were wholly good or problematic. And there was other kinds of resistance. So I didn't understand until I wrote this book, River of Shadows, about Muybridge, and that the great transformations had come, that the great Indian Wars were fought essentially to push the railroads through. They were like our war in Iraq, in defense of the free flow of petroleum. They were defending an industry, not, the culture in any other way. And Native Americans were literally ripping up telegraph poles, tearing down wires, sabotaging railroad tracks, because they knew that this industrialization of space was the end of their world. These are some of the pieces. Muybridge actually went on, traveled down the Central Pacific Railroad, Stanford, Crockers, Hopkins, and why am I forgetting the fourth one? Huntington's Railroad that went to Ogden, went to Utah, where it connected with the other half of the Union Pacific to form the Transcontinental Railroad. So he photographed the length of it, and you can see building these trestles over the landscape, making these cuts into the landscape, but the landscape itself was transformed so that the train could move rapidly over a smooth surface. Here's some of the snow sheds in the Sierra Nevada, which was this amazing challenge, bringing railroads through a wilderness that was, at a pass that was 7,000 feet high, with tunnels dug by Chinese labor through solid granite. This is the most extraordinary picture from Muybridge's series of railroad pictures. This is a group of Shoshone Indians and Cheyenne, what was it called? No, in Kareen, Utah. And it's very much a Muybridge picture. He photographed Native people with great respect and, and great interest repeatedly in Central America, and Yosemite and Alaska and Washington State. And in this extraordinary image. And the way that they look back at him, and one has his bow partly drawn as though he's going to shoot him. And the railroad tracks, the vanishing point literally surrounds them on either side, as though they're, the vanishing point of this kind of rapid motion is going to swallow them up. But this is an image of resistance. These people are looking with defiance at the camera, at the photographer, at this controlled space that surrounds them. It's just a beautiful, beautiful picture. Muybridge eclipsed himself over and over again. If he had not made his landscape photographs and urban photographs, his panoramas and his motion studies, people might pay more attention to him as a great ethnographic photographer, but he didn't. And these are some of the pictures of water in motion. You can see that, as the filmmaker Hollis Frampton said, you see not water but a tesseract of water, all the water that moved over what might have been a 5 or 10 minute exposure. There's a little man sitting still on the right of the image, not moving at all, so he's in focus. The water that's moving is a white blur. It goes into a lake that is much darker and clearer. And I think this projector is eating slides occasionally. Here's another one. A lot of photographers tried to avoid this filmy, white, ghostly substance that's water over at time. But Muybridge liked these strange accidents of time and almost sought them out. They're here repeatedly in his Yosemite pictures. So here he is at the Modoc War. Muybridge often had a lot of, he was working on multiple projects at once. He was the first photographer commissioned by the U.S. government to photograph a war. The war was the Modoc War of Native Americans in Northern California, in the biggest Indian war in the state, refusing to be relocated to a reservation in Oregon, fighting to stay where they were, to keep their relationship to time and place intact. And it was an extraordinary war. They fought with incredible determination and skill. A small group of about 50 men supported by women and other members of the community, elders and children, held off the U.S. Army for 6 months. And because they knew the lay of the land, their homeland so well. It was a labyrinth of lava from a volcanic eruption long ago. So Muybridge was making, those are 5 stereo cards, pictures overlaid on each other by yours truly when she made these slides about 10 years ago. And Muybridge was really interested in sequences too, in this kind of proto-cinematic world. So you can see the images traveling. He's panning the landscape and they all fit together. If you move them very rapidly through one of the stereo card holders that people used in those days, you could really see something close to a camera panning a landscape. And let me go back and leave you with one of these. So these are the lava beds. So he photographed the Modoc War simultaneously to beginning his experiments in instantaneous photography, photographing horses in motion, which was also, and it was 1872 was also the year that he completed his extraordinary mammoth plate photographs of Yosemite Valley. And he was busy and very interested in the challenges of photography in all directions. Despair and desperation had set in among the Indians of the far west in those years. The 1870 ghost dance came out of that feeling, and it spread across western Nevada, southern Oregon, and northern California. Began at the Walker River Paiute Reservation in west central Nevada, as did another version of the ghost dance a generation later when it spread across much of the interior west, including to the Lakota, which is what most people remember, because it often seems like the Lakota is all anybody remembers about Indians in the West. But, you know, things were happening further west. In 1869 or 1870, a Paiute prophet named Wodzibob, nephew of the great land rights activist Sarah Winnemucca, began to preach that the native dead were coming back and the whites were going to disappear. To bring these things about, believers were to paint their faces, to dance in a circle singing certain songs all night, usually for 5 nights, and to bathe after dancing. A similar doctrine was preached by a Wanapum Indian named Smahola, or Shouting Mountain, who came from where the Columbia and Snake Rivers met. The ghost dance seems to be about wish fulfillment more than anything else. Desperate wishes born out of hideous circumstances, out of a sense that nothing less than the apocalypse was needed. The Modocs in northeasternmost California were fighting a defensive battle, but perhaps it lasted so long because they kept hoping that the ghost dance would save them. Like Sitting Bull snatching a moment of stillness out of the middle of war, the ghost dancers, during their many months in the stronghold, the lava stronghold, seemed to be trying to seize time itself, to make it stand still or turn back. They had danced the ghost dance on the banks of the Lost River before the war began. One participant, the son of the leader, Shanchen John, recalled half a century later that the Paiutes came to the Klamath Reservation and said all were to believe that the dead were coming back. Dr. George, a Modoc shaman, brought the word to Tule Lake at the mouth of the Lost River, where Captain Jack's people, the Modocs, were. He came in the winter before the grass began to grow. He said the dead would come from the east when the grass was about 8 inches high. The deer and the animals were all coming back too. George said the white people would die out and only Indians would be on earth. The Creator was to come back with the dead. The whites were to burn up and disappear without even leaving ashes. The rules of the dance Dr. George brought were that you must dance or you would turn to rock. End quote from that oral history. A man named Jake from the neighboring Shasta tribe was told that the ghosts summoned by the dance had only one more creek to cross before they reached Tule Lake. Apparently the dead were pictured as crossing the landscape on foot, an army of the past marching to cancel out a terrible future. The Modocs were living at the end of time. The ghost dance was a technology. Literally, a technology is a systematic practice or knowledge of an art, and though we almost always apply the term to the scientific and mechanical, there's no reason not to apply it to other human-made techniques for producing desired results. Maybe the best definition would be, a technology is a practice, a technique, or a device for altering the world or the experience of the world. To propose annihilating the inexorable march of history and the irreversibility of death was to propose a technology as ambitious as a moonwalk or a gene splice. The ghost dance had its parallels in the spiritualist movements that began in the 1840s and reached its heights in the years after the Civil War, with millions of believers and practitioners in the United States. Spiritualism likewise sought to cross that great divide, that is death, and even the white raiment woman spiritualist sometimes wore to funerals seemed a defiance of death, like the ghost dance shirts of the 1890s. This spiritualism had close ties to the feminist movement of the middle decades of the 19th century. Women were the principal mediums in spiritualism, and it's so they have a woman's religion, an alternative source of power and an alternative kind of spirituality. In calling back the souls of the dead to communicate, these spiritualists seem to politely doubt that the dead were otherwise occupied with heaven, hell, and the authority of God. The supernatural is nowadays often seen as opposed to technologies, but the technologies of the era often seem supernatural themselves. In the well-known words of science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Such a remarkable statement, I'm going to read it again. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. It's only because nature no longer seems so strong and immutable, a force that changes no longer seem uncanny. In the beginning, electricity seemed spiritual, a form of the life force. It is electricity that brought Frankenstein's fictional monster to life in the teens of the 19th century. And a spiritualist machine of the 1840s that was supposed to generate a soul was electrical. Telegraphy was sometimes thought to magically transmit objects rather than signals. And in 1878, the San Francisco Chronicle published an article about a man getting evening calls from the dead on that new electrical invention, the telephone, whose disembodied voices still seemed uncanny. And here I want to make a brief testament to research for you graduate students there. I know there are certain sort of highly successful historians have graduate students do all the work for them, but it often seems like a methodology where you can only find what you know you're looking for, and that to find truly great material, you have to be looking for the unknown, to be ready for the unexpected, and to be there when it's discovered. Maybe great graduate students bring it back to you, but they probably bring you back what you asked for, and you never ask for enough. There was a myth that Muybridge's studio had burnt down in 1877 or early 1878, and he'd lost all his negatives, which is why he replaced his pretty good 1877 panorama of San Francisco, another very cinematic thing like this sequence of photos, but put together to make a several-foot-long panorama. There was a 360-degree circle, as though a camera had completely panned a horizon, a crazy image that was more than the eye could take in at once. So you're looking in all directions at once when you saw spherical space unfolded into a flat strip of photos. Muybridge replaced it in 1870, or he didn't replace it, he superseded it with a 17-foot-long, 22-inch high panorama that was superlative. It's like saying Michelangelo lost his sketchbook. So he made his doodles on the ceiling the next time where he wouldn't lose them. But so I was strongly doubted this fire, which nobody had talked about before the 20th century, but it was in a couple of the later sources I used. So I decided I had to go look for it. I read every issue of the Philadelphia Photographer during the years Muybridge had been active in the field, and hadn't seen a mention there, which seemed surprising. But I decided I would read every page every day of the San Francisco Chronicle during the 18 months when a fire might have happened, to look for any evidence of it. And that's how I came across this. There was no mention of it. I felt justified in making the judgment call that there was no fire, particularly since some of Muybridge's negatives showed up in the 1890s at Stanford's place. And I found this fabulous story about, and on the front page, not tongue-in-cheek at all, just with the sense we don't know what this new technology does, about a man getting evening calls from the dead on that new electrical invention, the telephone. Spirit photography, or photography of the souls who are supposed to appear at spiritualist seances, was often discussed and denounced over the years in the Philadelphia Photographer. And even late in the 1870s, the photographer John Thompson was reassuring a theoretical listener. He may be tempted to inquire, What occult science confers on this mystic apparatus the power of picturing objects placed before it, producing an image so perfect that alike no point of beauty, no spot or blemish, escapes its microscopic observation. It is some solace to know that the camera and lens lend themselves to no kind of trickery. There is no medium, spiritual within or without, to link the process to the unseen world and works of darkness. Which is to say, the changes brought about by technology seemed supernatural at first, and photography was associated with the dead, with death, both in the many, many images of the dead made during the early years of the medium, and the way a photograph seemed to cheat death by making at least appearance permanent. Muybridge, when he was photographing the Modoc War, was on his way to inventing a new kind of photography, a photography that with the aid of high-speed electric shutters would make it possible to recapture what had always been lost in the stream of time, not just an appearance, but a gesture, a motion, an act, those immaterial events of which time itself is made. Even Thomas Edison, when he discussed the origins of cinema, invoked the supernatural. He wrote, "In the year 1887, it occurred to me that it was possible to devise an instrument which would do for the eye what the phonograph does for the ear, and that by a combination of the two, all motion and sound could be recorded and reproduced simultaneously. This idea, the germ of which came from a little toy called the zoetrope and the work of Muybridge and Murray and others, has now been accomplished. I believe that in coming years, by my own work and that of Dixon, Muybridge, Murray, and others who will doubtless enter the field, that grand opera can be given at the Metropolitan Opera House at New York, with artists and musicians long since dead." Doesn't that sound terrifying and uncanny and weird and otherworldly? But if you've watched a movie with Marilyn Monroe or Jimmy Stewart or, anybody like that in it, you've watched, the equivalent of grand opera with artists and musicians long since dead. If you've heard Churchill or FDR on the radio, if you've heard, we hang out with the dead all the time. They speak to us, they walk among us in films. This is a truly strange thing, except that we're so used to it. So, in other words, Edison was saying cinema would itself be a kind of ghost dance. It was and is a breach in the wall between the past and the present, one that lets the dead return, albeit as images of flickering light rather than phantoms in the dark, or armies marching across the land. Anyone who watches old movies watches the dead, and Edison was not yet insulated as we are against what is macabre about this. In the first years of cinema, the Lumiere brothers made a short film that showed a few men knocking down a wall, and then ran it in reverse so that the men walked backward, and the wall arose whole from its own rubble. For audiences then it was deeply disturbing and more than a little magical. They were not yet used to time as a toy in men's hands. The ghost dance itself was an effort to make time run backwards like a film, so the whites vanished, the game reappeared, even death reversed itself. And obviously, the ghost dance didn't work. There are still descendants of those Modocs, not very many of them in their own homeland now. There's other ways Native Americans have come back, and a lot of my Native American friends are photographers who've mastered the technology. And Muybridge would continue to move forward with photography. This is one of his last non-motion study photographs, except that it is a motion study. It's an eclipse photographed and then sequenced like a motion study, so you can see the movement of the shadow across the surface of the earth. He was going to begin this gridded format, and so you can't quite see this, but this is the extraordinary document that hadn't been published before. I found in the Stanford archives from Muybridge's photographic assistant 50 years later, describing the birth of what would become cinema. I think I'll just read it to you because it's tiny. "I carried 6 buckets of water, the old-fashioned wooden buckets, into the dark room. You have to remember that when you made a photograph, you coated the emulsion, exposed it, and developed it on site. It was, you made your film and developed it as well as taking the picture. It was a whole lot more demanding even than photography as we knew it before digital, where Kodak made your film and you usually sent it to someone to be processed. So he carried 6 buckets, and when the horses sprang the instantaneous shutters by means of the threads across the racetrack, Mr. Muybridge immediately took the plate holder from the camera went into the darkroom and developed singing. Being a boy between 16 and 17 years old, I am now 65 years, I distinctly recall the joy and pleasure which, when Mr. Muybridge called from the dark room, "I've got the picture of the horses jumping from the ground." To the best of my knowledge, Mr. Muybridge was the first photographer in the world to make instantaneous pictures of horses in motion. I am the only living man who recalls Mr. Muybridge's attempts at instantaneous photography, and were it not for the fire and earthquake, I could have shown evidence of early photography when employed by Mr. George B. Morse, a photo dealer. So this is this guy recalling the beginning of these inventions, these sequences, which is what Muybridge was making. He started in 1872, gotten very indistinct single images. With the help of Stanford's engineers, he made these electrical shutters, and he'd set up banks of 12 cameras that would take sequences of images very quickly and then put them together. And I'm beginning to think maybe I should get all these slides transposed to, scanned and on my computer, so I could show you can show people what an animation would be like of these images. You can animate, and it's often used now. When people teach digital animation, they're often given Muybridge's images to work with to animate, and you can make all of them move, some of them jerkily, some of them smoothly. They're very short, they're like a second or a few seconds long, but that horse gallops, and as it did in the 1870s. Muybridge began to take other subjects. As I said, Stanford always thought this was about understanding horse anatomy and gait and training, and never saw beyond that. Muybridge always knew it was about much, much more. So, and finished this project with Stanford, had a hideous falling out with him, where Stanford tried to deny him credit for all his work. And then the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia sponsored him to expand the project. And these were really made for artists and scientists to use often, but clearly went above and beyond their official purposes. Muybridge was fascinated, for example, by water, and the fact that water falling, being splashed in the 1870s, was frozen in motion, and that you're now looking at 130-year-old splashes exactly as the water fell then, and a nude woman who probably, died more than a century ago, but who could be animated so you could see her walking. He really loved the water ones. I think of this as a water angel. Nobody had ever seen water in motion like this. There were so many gestures, the figures of a horse moving, of water falling, of a somersault, of a runner, of people I'd never seen before. It really undermined a lot of the painting of the day. They had suddenly hit a fork in the road. Were you going to photograph the world as it appeared to the naked eye or to the camera? Those were suddenly two different things. And one art historian thinks it was the death of academic painting, that painting, which had been our most accurate means of recording things, had been superseded in some ways by photography and was going to be freed up to become more symbolic, more experimental, and photography would assume that burden of historical documentation. I just love the way that the water fans out like some sort of celestial garment from her, and that you're seeing this frozen water so many years apart. And this is one of the images that might have been mentioned in the wonderful introduction of a pigeon flying, and that'll be our closing image. And wow, I've been going for a while. Picture a racetrack in 1877 with a racehorse running its oval circuit of earth. For the horse, the race is from nothing but perhaps a touch of the whip to nothing but the end of the exercise. For the handlers, the horse is attempting to minimize the amount of time it takes to travel from one place to another, to defeat the limits that nature places on the movement of bodies. The horse is training, that is alone on the track, racing the clock rather than other horses. Muybridge will seize hold of that running, stop it on film, take it apart and put it back together again like a puzzle. It takes the speed of a technological breakthrough to capture the speed of the horse, so that like a machine it can be understood. And this speed is not a change in degree, but a change in kind, a speed up that takes humanity across the threshold into a new world of knowledge and representation. Past a certain point, everything, anything disappears into the visible imperceptibility we call a a veil of speed covering up the erotics of motion. Muybridge would bring the blurred back into sharp focus and would turn out that stripping speed of its veils had more far-reaching possibilities than anyone had imagined. There were three great breakthroughs in Muybridge's motion studies. The first was the achievement of a photographic process fast enough to capture bodies in motion. The second was the creation of successive images that, mounted together, reconstituted a whole cycle of motion rather than isolating a single moment. And the third was their reanimation as a moving picture. In 1877, he'd only achieved the first, which required breakthroughs in photochemistry and the development of a very fast shutter. Muybridge may have overestimated the speed of his explosions, but there are dozens, even hundreds of times faster than what anybody else was doing. Many were achieving instantaneous photographs, but in the era of wet plate photography, only he did it methodically, reliably, repeatably. The second and third breakthroughs were to come respectively in 1878 and 1879, first with the construction of the electrical shutter and sequential cameras, and second with the zoopraxiscope that allowed the multiple images to be projected as what appeared to be a single image in motion, which is all that cinema ever was multiple frames with blackouts in between, so that they, its motion pictures were actually called the flickers, among other things, early in their era, when they flickered a little more visibly, so that you would see that simulation of motion, that's many still images going by fast. And so, when photography itself was invented, Edgar Allan Poe declared, "All experience in matters of philosophical discovery teaches us that in such discovery it is unforeseen upon which we must calculate most largely." In hindsight, these horse photographs are called the genesis of cinema, but in 1878 it looked like a breakthrough for photography and for the study of rapid motion, and the latter seemed of most significance for painters, physiologists, and equestrians. Though cinema would in the end devote itself primarily to entertaining fictions, the intermediate medium seemed at the time like a shift toward science. So, Muybridge pursued the transformation of bodies and places into representations that in some ways fed that unslaked desire for landscape, geography, beauty, embodiment, and the life of the senses. But Stanford, the railroad builder, pursued the annihilation of time and space without mercy, without misgivings, without deference to what might be lost. And this might be the difference between Hollywood and Silicon Valley. Hollywood would become the center of the world of movies, while Silicon Valley the center of the world of information technology. And the way these two institutions dominate the world, one can say California is the center of the contemporary world, but of a world in which time and space have been annihilated, a world that is in some obscure way so disembodied, dislocated, and dematerialized that the very idea of a center is perplexing. It could be said that California is the center of decenteredness, for another part of the rhetoric of the technologies of Silicon Valley is that location will no longer matter, as everything is linked up to everything else, that even bodies will become irrelevant. And Hollywood provides fantasies that spread everywhere like weeds into local landscapes with their local stories. This is what the Modocs were resisting with their insistence on staying in their own place, where their creation mythologies describe the landscape around them, of staying in a kind of time and place. Fighting a battle against these transformations that many native peoples fought, and in many ways lost. But not entirely, because they're still here, and some of those practices and consciousnesses are still here, although they're the minority voice and a majority voice that's sped up, technological, displaced, denatured. Muybridge and Stanford died far too soon to have any inklings of the high-speed world of electronic communications and information processing, but their own pursuits and desires prefigured it and laid some of the groundwork. This too is inscribed in the landscape. Stanford pursued speed in its most evident 19th century forms, railroads and racehorses. Muybridge refined speed from a material to a visual phenomenon with the most high-speed photographs of his time. There are infinite ways to measure what has been gained and what has been lost, and only one clear thing now. The world is utterly changed. Thank you.